History is filled with battles that celebrate overwhelming power, massive armies, and inevitable victories. But some stories don't fit that pattern. Some moments are so uncomfortable, so disruptive to accepted truth, that history quietly looks the other way. This is one of those moments. 800 warriors stood in the path of 50,000 invaders, not as a legend passed down through exaggeration, but as a real confrontation that shattered logic and expectation. On the surface, the numbers alone make this story sound impossible. 50,000 soldiers represent conquest, certainty, and total domination. Against such force, resistance is supposed to collapse instantly. 800 defenders should not delay an invasion. They should not slow it. They should not matter. And yet they did, enough to force history itself into silence. What makes this last stand even more disturbing is how rarely it is discussed. It does not dominate documentaries. It is not widely taught in classrooms. It does not sit comfortably among famous victories or heroic triumphs. Instead, it exists on the edges of recorded history, mentioned briefly, then moved past. The question is not whether it happened. The question is why so few people know about it. The answer lies in what this battle represents. It challenges the idea that power always wins. It exposes the fragile nature of large armies when faced with discipline, preparation, and absolute resolve. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals how stories that embarrass empires tend to disappear over time.
The world the 800 lived in was already trembling before the first sword was raised. Borders were fragile, alliances were brittle, and rumors of invasion traveled faster than armies themselves. Entire regions lived in a state of anxious waiting, knowing that when the invaders arrived, resistance would be brief and mercy rare. Power in this world did not belong to justice or tradition. It belonged to whoever could bring the most soldiers to the field.
Political authority was fractured. Rival leaders argued over territory, while the threat grew closer each day. Some believed negotiation was possible. Others argued that surrender would spare lives. Most simply hoped the storm would pass them by. Very few prepared for war. Preparation required sacrifice, and sacrifice demanded unity, something this world no longer possessed. The invaders had already proven their intent elsewhere. Cities that resisted were erased. Cities that surrendered survived, but at a cost that lingered for generations. Tribute was demanded. Identity was stripped away. Local rulers became puppets, their power dependent on obedience. Fear became a weapon as effective as any blade, and it worked. One by one, strongholds opened their gates without a fight. As news spread, refugees moved ahead of the invasion, carrying stories of brutality and collapse. These were not exaggerations meant to frighten children. They were warnings. Entire communities displaced, defenses overwhelmed within days. The message was clear. Resistance only delayed the inevitable. Against this backdrop, the location where the 800 stood gained sudden importance. It was not just another settlement or defensive position. It was a choke point, a place where movement could be slowed, where numbers could be restricted, where a stand, however brief, could matter. Strategically, it was valuable. Symbolically, it was dangerous. Leaders faced an impossible choice: hold the position and risk annihilation, or abandon it and allow the invasion to sweep forward unchecked. Reinforcements were unlikely. Aid would arrive too late, if at all. To stay meant accepting that survival was not guaranteed. To leave meant surrendering the future. Most chose caution. History often rewards caution, but caution rarely creates stories that endure. The 800 did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as a barrier, a delay, a message written in defiance rather than hope.
As the invasion drew closer, the atmosphere thickened with tension. Every decision felt heavy, Every night carried the possibility that it would be the last before the storm broke. Supplies were counted, weapons were checked and rechecked. There were no speeches promising victory, only quiet understanding. This was a world where the balance had already tipped, where power believed itself unstoppable, and where fear had become the natural response to approaching armies. It was into this moment, this fragile, desperate pause, that the 800 chose to stand. They were not blind to reality. They knew what 50,000 soldiers could do, but they also understood something the invaders did not yet realize. In a world ruled by fear, even a small act of resistance could send shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. And soon, those shockwaves would collide head-on with an army that believed nothing could stand in its way. Section 3. The invading force, 50,000 and relentless. The invading army was not just large, it was methodical, experienced, and terrifyingly confident. 50,000 soldiers moved as a single force, backed by a system that had already crushed resistance across vast territories. These were not men marching into uncertainty. They were men who had seen cities fall, walls burn, and defenders beg. Every step forward reinforced the belief that victory was inevitable. This force was built for conquest. Infantry formed the bulk of the army, ranks deep and constantly replenished. Archers followed close behind, capable of turning open ground into death zones within moments. Cavalry units stood ready to exploit weakness, cutting down retreating enemies without mercy. Commanders coordinate movement with practiced efficiency, relying on numbers, pressure, and exhaustion to break opponents long before decisive blows were struck.
What made the invaders truly dangerous was not just size, but momentum. They had not been stopped before. Each surrender reinforced their reputation. Each collapse made the next resistance less likely. Fear traveled ahead of them, softening targets before swords ever crossed. When people heard 50,000 were coming, they did not think of fighting. They thought of surviving. Supply lines stretched far behind the army, carrying food, weapons, and reinforcements. This was not a force rushing blindly forward. It was a machine designed to sustain itself deep in enemy territory. Where defenders rationed carefully, the invaders consumed freely. Where locals worried about shortages, the army advanced without pause. Time was on their side. From the invaders' perspective, the 800 standing in their path were insignificant, a delay at most, a footnote. Scouts reported the position, the numbers, the lack of reinforcements. Commanders calculated losses and moved on. No special strategy was required, no caution necessary. Overwhelm them and continue forward. That had always worked. Yet this confidence masked a critical weakness. The army relied on the belief that resistance would crumble quickly. It was designed to crush panic, not confront discipline. Many soldiers were conscripts or forced allies, fighting not for belief, but because refusal meant death. Their strength came from the mass around them, not from individual resolve. As the army approached the defensive position, the scale difference became visible. From the defenders' vantage point, the invaders seemed endless. Lines stretched to the horizon, banners filled the air. The ground trembled beneath thousands of marching feet. Any rational assessment pointed to the same conclusion. This was unwinnable.
But conquest has a blind spot. When victory becomes routine, adaptation slows. The invaders had learned how to defeat fear, but not how to confront men who did not fear death. They had mastered the art of overwhelming, but not the challenge of breaking a force that refused to retreat. As the 50,000 closed in, certainty filled their ranks. This would be quick, efficient, forgettable, another obstacle erased. They did not yet understand that they were about to face something they had not planned for. Not an army fighting for survival, but warriors fighting to delay, to resist, and to make conquest hurt. And in that miscalculation, the seeds of disbelief were already planted. Section 4. The 800, who they were and why they stayed. The 800 who chose to stand were not a random collection of men caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were veterans, defenders, and warriors shaped by a world that had taught them one brutal lesson. When power comes for you, hesitation is fatal. Each man understood exactly what 50,000 invaders represented. None of them were ignorant. None of them were fooled by hope. They stayed anyway. These warriors came from different backgrounds, but they shared a common reality. Retreat would not save their world. It would only delay its destruction. If they fled, the invasion would roll forward unchallenged, swallowing towns, families, and futures. Staying did not guarantee survival, but leaving guaranteed loss. For them, the choice was not between life and death. It was between meaning and surrender.
Training played a critical role in this decision. The 800 were not untested fighters. They knew formation. They understood terrain. They had fought before, survived before, and learned that discipline could hold where panic failed. They trusted the man beside them, not because of friendship, but because survival had taught them that cohesion was stronger than courage alone. They did not rely on speeches or promises. They relied on preparation. More important than skill was mindset. These men were not chasing glory. There would be no triumphal return, no songs written in their honor. They understood that history might never remember their names, but they also understood that resistance itself could be a weapon. A delay could buy time. Time could save others, and saving others, even unseen, was worth the cost. Why they stayed is inseparable from why others fled. Fear breaks armies faster than swords. The 800 had already confronted that fear long before the invaders arrived. They had accepted loss as a possibility, even an expectation. That acceptance stripped fear of its power. A man who has already faced the worst is not easily intimidated. Leadership reinforced this resolve. Commanders did not promise victory, they promised purpose. Orders were clear, roles were defined. There was no confusion about what was expected. Each man knew his place in the line and the importance of holding it. In chaos, clarity becomes strength. There was also defiance, a quiet refusal to accept that numbers alone should decide the fate of their world. The 800 represented a line drawn not on a map, but in belief. If they fell, they would fell having forced the invaders to fight for every step. If they stood, even briefly, they would prove that power was not absolute.
The hours before the battle were heavy with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the tense stillness that settles when everyone understands what is coming, and no one pretends otherwise. The 800 moved through their preparations with practiced routine. Weapons were checked, armor adjusted, positions reviewed. Every action was deliberate, stripped of urgency, as if slowing time itself could bring clarity. There were no speeches meant to inspire false hope, no promises of victory whispered to steady nerves. These men did not need to be convinced to stand. That decision had already been made long before the invaders came into view. What remained was acceptance. Calm did not come from confidence in survival, but from certainty of purpose. Some spoke quietly among themselves, not about the battle ahead, but about ordinary things, familiar memories, shared moments from lives that already felt distant. Others sat alone, staring at the ground or the horizon, letting their thoughts settle. Fear was present, but controlled. It existed without being allowed to command. Beyond their position, the signs of the approaching army became impossible to ignore. Dust clouds rose in the distance. The ground carried a faint rhythmic tremor from thousands of marching feet. Every sound felt amplified in the waiting. The storm was coming, and it was vast.
The invasion did not begin with chaos. It began with movement, a slow, deliberate advance as the first ranks of the invading army stepped forward, banners lifting, armor catching the light. From a distance, it looked orderly, almost ceremonial. 50,000 soldiers moving with confidence, earned through countless victories. Against them, the 800 remained still, silent,
and unmoving.
When the first wave closed in, the difference in mindset became immediately visible. The invaders expected panic, hesitation, or at least noise. Instead, they were met with discipline. Shields rose in unison, weapons aligned. The defenders did not rush forward or shout challenges. They waited. That stillness unsettled the attackers more than any threat could have done. The first clash shattered the illusion of inevitability. The invaders surged into the defensive line, expecting it to buckle under pressure. It did not. Bodies collided, shields slammed together. The impact echoed across the battlefield like thunder. The 800 absorbed the force, feet planted, formation intact. Where attackers expected collapse, they found resistance that refused to give ground. In the narrow space, numbers became a liability. The invaders pressed from behind, pushing their own front ranks into the defenders' weapons. Confusion spread as soldiers found themselves trapped between enemy steel and the weight of their own army. Orders were shouted, then lost. Momentum stalled. What was meant to be a swift breakthrough turned into a grinding struggle. The defenders fought methodically. Every movement had purpose. When one man fell, another stepped forward. When pressure increased, the line tightened. There was no pursuit of retreating enemies, no reckless advance. The goal was not destruction, but endurance. Each minute held was a minute stolen from the invaders' certainty. Archers were brought forward to break the resistance. Arrows filled the air, darkening the sky in waves. Shields rose again, overlapping, deflecting the storm. Some arrows found their mark. Men fell. The line adjusted without panic. Gaps closed. The formation survived. What should have been a decisive tactic became another failed attempt to force collapse.
As hours passed, the battlefield transformed. The ground grew slick with blood. The air thickened with dust, sweat, and the metallic scent of combat. The invaders rotated fresh troops forward, confident that exhaustion would eventually do what weapons had not. The defenders felt the strain, muscles burning, breaths heavier with each exchange. Still, they held. For the invaders, disbelief crept in. This was not how conquest was supposed to unfold. Every delay felt wrong. Every fallen soldier chipped away at confidence. Whispers spread through the ranks. How were they still standing? Why were they not breaking? Fear does not announce itself loudly. It begins quietly, in the pause before the next charge. The defenders sensed the shift. They could feel hesitation on the other side of the line. Attacks lost coordination. Strikes came faster, less controlled. This was the moment discipline mattered most. The 800 did not exploit it recklessly. They maintained their rhythm, letting the invaders exhaust themselves against unyielding resistance. Time stretched. The sun climbed higher. What should have been a brief engagement turned into a brutal stalemate. Each side paid a price, but only one had expected the cost. The invaders had come prepared to conquer, not to bleed for every step. The defenders had come knowing exactly what this would demand. Eventually, pressure began to tell. Injuries accumulated, losses mounted, fatigue slowed reactions. The line bent, but it did not break. The 800 understood that this could not last forever. They were buying time, not miracles. But even that understanding carried power. Every additional moment of resistance reshaped the narrative unfolding across the battlefield.
By the time the invaders pulled back to regroup, the impossible had already happened. An army of 50,000 had been forced to pause, to reconsider, to adapt. The 800 still stood, battered and bloodied, but unbroken. The invasion had begun as a calculation. It was becoming something else entirely, a lesson. And as the invaders prepared their next move, one truth had become undeniable. Overwhelming force alone was not enough, not against warriors who had accepted the cost of standing in the way. Section 7. How 800 held back 50,000. What allowed 800 warriors to resist a force more than 60 times their size was not chance, nor was it reckless courage. It was control.
control over space, over movement, and most importantly, over fear. While the invaders relied on mass and momentum, the defenders relied on structure and discipline, turning every disadvantage into a weapon. The first and most critical factor was terrain. The 800 positioned themselves where the invading army could not deploy its full strength. Narrow ground limited how many attackers could engage at once, transforming 50,000 soldiers into a slow, crowded funnel. In this confined space, numbers lost their power. Only a fraction of the invading force could fight at any given moment, and that fraction was forced to meet defenders who were prepared, steady, and coordinated. Formation amplified this advantage. The defenders fought as a single unit rather than as individuals. Shields overlapped, lines remained tight. Every man knew his role and trusted the men beside him to fulfill theirs. When pressure increased, the formation absorbed it. When openings appeared, they were exploited with precision. This unity prevented panic and ensured that no single mistake could collapse the entire line.
Rotation was equally important. Exhaustion destroys armies faster than blades, and the 800 understood this. Frontline warriors were rotated backward when fatigue set in, replaced seamlessly by fresh fighters. This kept resistance consistent and prevented the gradual weakening that invaders expected to exploit. Where the attackers relied on constant pressure, the defenders relied on endurance management. Psychology played a decisive role. The defenders did not shout, taunt, or rush forward. Their silence was intentional. It unsettled the invaders, who were accustomed to enemies breaking under noise and intimidation. Each failed assault chipped away at confidence. Soldiers began to hesitate. Hesitation spread. Fear does not need numbers to grow, it only needs doubt. The invaders, many of whom were conscripts or forced allies, fought because they had to. The defenders fought because they chose to. That difference mattered. Threats of punishment and promises of reward lost effectiveness against warriors who had already accepted death as a possibility. The 800 were not immune to fear, but they had learned to control it. The invaders had not. Leadership further reinforced this control. Commanders fought alongside their men, sharing risk rather than issuing orders from safety. Instructions were simple, direct, and instantly obeyed. There was no confusion about objectives. Hold the line, delay the advance, make every step costly. Clarity replaced complexity, and clarity sustained resistance. The defenders also understood what they were not trying to do. They were not attempting to destroy the invading army. They were not chasing decisive victory. They were buying time. Every minute the invaders were delayed disrupted supply lines, strained morale, and weakened the illusion of inevitability. This focus prevented reckless decisions and preserved cohesion under pressure.
As hours turned into an exhausting cycle of attack and resistance, the imbalance in purpose became increasingly clear. The invaders sought conquest, the defenders sought meaning. One relied on numbers, the other relied on resolve. And in that contrast, the impossible began to feel achievable, not as triumph, but as endurance. The 800 did not hold back 50,000 by overpowering them. They held them back by denying them what conquest depends on most, certainty. And as that certainty eroded, the battle shifted from a calculation of strength into a test of will, one the invaders had never planned to face. Section 8. Betrayal, Collapse, and the Breaking Point. Every stand, no matter how disciplined, carries a breaking point. For the 800, that moment did not arrive through brute force alone. It arrived through information. Somewhere beyond the battlefield, knowledge changed hands, a route, a weakness, a way around the position that had stalled the invasion for hours. What strength could not achieve, betrayal now made possible. The shift was subtle at first. Attacks grew more coordinated. Pressure increased from unexpected angles. The defenders sensed it before they fully understood it. The battlefield no longer felt contained. The narrow ground that had protected them began to close in from multiple directions. The realization spread quietly through the ranks. They were being outflanked. Losses mounted quickly after that. The invaders attacked with renewed confidence, knowing the defenders' advantage was slipping away. Exhaustion that had been managed now became dangerous. Wounds that could once be rotated out stayed in the line. Familiar faces disappeared. The formation tightened, not as a tactic, but as a necessity.
The moment of choice arrived with brutal clarity. Retreat was still possible for some. Escape routes existed, narrow and dangerous, but real. To leave would mean survival. To stay would mean the end. Orders were given. Some were released from the line. The rest remained, not because they were forced, but because they chose to be there. As the invaders closed in from multiple sides, discipline was pushed to its limit. Commands were harder to hear. Movement required constant adjustment. The silence that once unsettled the enemy was replaced by the raw sounds of close combat, steel striking steel, labored breathing, cries of pain. Control gave way to endurance. Yet even now, collapse did not come easily. The defenders adapted, turning outwards, forming a shrinking circle of resistance. Every step cost more. Every strike demanded more strength than remained. But resolve did not vanish with fatigue. It hardened. When survival is no longer the goal, fear loses its grip. The invaders, expecting panic, found defiance instead. Every fallen defender was replaced by another stepping forward. Every opening was met with resistance. Progress was made only through blood. This was no longer conquest, it was punishment. Eventually, inevitability asserted itself. Numbers began to matter again. The line fractured. Individuals fought where formations once stood. The 800 were no longer holding ground. They were holding meaning. Each moment of resistance now served only one purpose: to leave an impression that could not be erased. This was the breaking point, not because the defenders failed, but because the limits of endurance had been reached. What followed was not defeat in the traditional sense. It was a final declaration that even when surrounded, even when betrayed, even when exhausted beyond reason, there are moments when standing firm matters more than standing at all.
Section 9. Aftermath. What the world learned. When the fighting finally ended, the battlefield fell into an uneasy silence. The ground was littered with bodies, shattered weapons, and broken formations that told a story no report could fully explain. The invaders stood victorious in the narrowest sense of the word, but there was no celebration, no triumph. What should have been a swift conquest had become a costly ordeal that left its mark on every rank. For the invading force, progress resumed, but without confidence. Soldiers who had expected an effortless advance now moved with caution. The memory of disciplined resistance lingered. Whispers traveled through the army, carried by those who had survived the front lines. Stories of men who did not flee, of warriors who fought until exhaustion and beyond. The idea of invincibility had been damaged, and once doubt enters an army, it never truly leaves. Strategically, the delay mattered. Time lost here forced adjustments elsewhere. Supply lines stretched thinner, plans shifted, momentum slowed. The invasion continued, but it no longer felt inevitable. Every future resistance was now viewed through the lens of what 800 had managed to achieve. Fear was no longer one-sided. For the defenders' world, the loss was heavy. Families mourned, settlements braced for what came next. There was no illusion that this stand had saved everyone, but it had changed something deeper. It proved that resistance was possible, that overwhelming force could be challenged, that surrender was not the only response to invasion.
History is not written to remember everything. It is written to make sense of power. Empires record victories that justify their expansion, while defeats and embarrassments are softened, shortened, or erased entirely. This last stand belonged to that second category. It did not end with conquest denied or territory reclaimed. It ended with sacrifice, doubt, and an uncomfortable truth that neither side benefited from preserving in full.
For the invaders, this battle was a flaw in the narrative of inevitability.
Their power depended on reputation as much as force. Fear opened gates faster than armies ever could. A story in which 800 warriors delayed, wounded, and unsettled 50,000 soldiers threatened that reputation. It suggested limits, and limits are dangerous for empires built on the idea of unstoppable momentum. So the story was reduced to numbers, stripped of detail, and allowed to fade. For those the 800 defended, the truth was equally painful. There was no clean victory to celebrate. No leaders returned to be honored. Families were left with loss, not triumph. It is easier to remember stories that end in survival and reward than those that demand sacrifice without immediate gain. Over time, the stand became a footnote rather than a focus. There is also the problem of simplicity. History prefers clear outcomes, winners and losers, heroes who return home. This last stand offered none of that. The defenders lost their lives, but won something harder to measure. The invaders advanced, but lost certainty. Who then won? When answers become complicated, stories are often left untold. Yet forgetting does not diminish meaning, it only hides it. The power of this last stand lies in what it revealed, that resistance does not require victory to matter, that delaying an unstoppable force can reshape the course of events, and that fear loses its grip when people choose purpose over survival. You've never heard of this last stand because it does not flatter authority, it does not glorify conquest, it does not resolve neatly. Instead, it asks a dangerous question. What if the smallest forces, under the right conditions, can force even the largest powers to hesitate?
And perhaps that is where it belongs, not as a legend polished for comfort, but as a reminder that when the world insists resistance is useless, even a forgotten stand can prove otherwise.